Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
All right. Well, let's move on to the CNET content pruning discussion / debate. So, David, what was that about?
Yes. So CNET was, quote unquote, air quotes, busted by Gizmodo this week for pruning a bunch of what they categorized as old content. And the search liaison, we won't make this an ad hominem section of the podcast here, but the search liaison for Google came out and said, hey, you shouldn't do this. Like you shouldn't prune your content. The notion that Google doesn't like old content is just wrong. Like you should do helpful content instead. And here's a link to our developer guidelines around helpful content. So if you read that advice in a really narrow framing, there's nothing inaccurate about it. But I think that the takeaway from the content is intended to be don't prune content, which is a piece of very bad SEO advice, as Lily Ray from AMSIP Digital actually commented in the Gizmodo article. She was a little more circumspect than I am being, and saying, in every case, this may not be, the best path to go down. But anyhow, the great quote, it sounds like CNET has a really good SEO team, frankly. The quote from their representative, Taylor Canada, is removing content from our site is not a decision we take lightly. Our teams analyze many data points to determine whether there are pages on CNET that are not currently serving a meaningful audience. This is an industry-wide best practice for large sites like ours, parenthetically small sites too, that are driven by SEO traffic. In an ideal world, we'd leave all of our content on our site in perpetuity. Unfortunately, we are penalized by the modern internet for leaving all previously published content live on our site. This reflects a very good understanding of how Google works, particularly on a large site like CNET, where crawl budget is a real thing. And certainly domain equity and how you distribute your domain equity is a real thing. So I think the search liaison's comment that deleting old content is a bad idea, read narrowly, totally fine with it. But the takeaway that you shouldn't delete content that's not performing well is a very bad idea. And you absolutely should do this, particularly if Google Search Console and Google Analytics are showing very low engagement with content. At that point, it might still be helpful, but it's helpful to such a small percentage of users. You're better off either consolidating that content into another page on the site that's talking about a similar theme, or just getting rid of it altogether. So,
and I think I read a comment from them that indicated that they were looking at how helpful content was. For one of the examples I gave of unhelpful content was AOL pricing tiers from 1996 as a typically unhelpful content that they were pruning. So I think they're very laser focused on this. To some extent, there's a certain tragedy in it from a historical point of view. One of the reasons I had never edited my article, even if I offended somebody, was I felt like this was an important record of the history of what we saw when we saw it. And I think there's something to be said for that, even if it doesn't get traffic, it's there, maybe, right? But it's still, they're right. If they're going to get better results, and they have to do what they have to do, and they're doing it.
That's right.
Google
created this problem, right? Like Google
Yes.
doesn't have to treat domain equity the way that they do and treat crawl budgets the way that they do. So I think, there is a bit of a self-serving rationale behind Google not wanting publishers to delete content, is then all of their AI has fewer artifacts to train itself on. So,
yeah, which even if it's copyrighted, though, Google thinks they should be able to use it to train their AI. Speak of hypocrisy. There's a huge one. Got to opt out of it.
And they want opt-out rules rather than opt-in. But robots TXT. Well, so just real quickly for the practitioners at home, what would your advice be? Kevin Indig talks a lot about updating content. So what's the difference between, what's the consideration around updating something versus pruning it?
Well, so you should absolutely update out-of-date content that is still receiving a meaningful number of visits from search, or visits from anywhere. It could be maybe you have a really popular newsletter that you link to a piece of content regularly and people still visit it. That's something that you might want to update if it's no longer accurate based on a change in circumstances. But if content literally is not being seen by anyone, but it's still getting linked to in your site architecture, and Google is still spending time, you can look at your log files to detect that Google is still coming around and hitting that content. That is a wasted opportunity that is much better served with a piece of content that is engaging to users and also is better placed in your site architecture to maximize its performance.
Okay, all right. Good. Thank you for the helpful, practical, tactical advice.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.